From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Nation. I'm Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. Welcome to another Rare Book Forum, and thank you for being another massive crowd again. It's exciting, isn't it? It's good to see this. I've said this before, especially in terms of the wonderful experience we have with the Corcoran interns, that is the students from, Carrie, help me, the title. Art in the Book program at the Corcoran College of Art. Those internships in particular are very near and dear to those of us who work in the division because they're intensive. There's a real passion behind the work of the Corcoran students. And in particular, the thing that always gets us is they get to play with the books that we want to play with. And that's certainly the case today with Sarah Denslow's presentation. She got to play with the PopUp Books after all. And we're all very excited. I wasn't the lead guy this time around. Jackie Colburn, who's a rare book cataloger from the cataloging team, the rare cataloging team, and one of the principals involved with our juvenilia collection here in RBSCD was the main contact. So I'm going to have her introduce Sarah. But I want to thank all of you for being loyal and coming by. And as you can see already, it's going to be a very interesting talk. So I'm going to introduce Jackie Colburn. Excuse me.
Thank you all for being here today. I don't want you to think that Sarah and I have just been playing with books all semester, but though we have done quite a bit of that, and we've had a very good time. As part of Sarah's internship, she got an awful lot of work done for the library. As she was preparing for her talk and as she was learning about the collection, for one thing, she's rehoused dozens and dozens of our movable books, so they are now in acid-free enclosures and can go back to the stacks in safety. And she's also added genre terms to the records that for the books that were cataloged, which will be very helpful for researchers in the future. And she's identified books that need cataloging. But possibly the part of the project that we both enjoyed the most is the discoveries that we made in the stacks. Because Sarah is a terrific book sleuth, we were able to find movable books that we didn't know we had, and we found books that we might have known we had, but we didn't know were movable. And so there was often great rejoicing in the stacks. Look what we found! And it's been very exciting, and I've enjoyed working with Sarah very much. So I will stop talking to you, and I will let Sarah talk. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to Mark and Jackie and everyone here at the library. Everyone, especially in the last few days, has just been so helpful in preparing this exhibition and speech, and it's been really wonderful. And I think we've got some really very exciting books to show today, and I'm so excited to be giving this speech because for months now I've been telling everyone I saw the most amazing book at the Library of Congress today. And then I try to describe it, and of course, you know, describing a book when you can't look at it is hard enough, but these are pop-up and movable books. And so now finally I get to show not only pictures, but we have these wonderful books on display. So hopefully this will be really, I'm very excited. I hope everyone else is very excited to see the books as well. I guess I will just go ahead and get started here. They did not tell me there was going to be video equipment, so hopefully I'll be speaking loud enough to get on the microphone. I'm not. So the first thing, when I started doing this internship, and we decided I was going to be working with the toy and movable books, everyone kept asking me, well, what is a toy and movable book? And why don't you just call them pop-up books? So to answer that, Pop-up books are essentially a subcategory of the toy and movable book umbrella. And pop-up books, they have a 3D structure that sort of pull away from the page. Now, I don't have any pop-up books pictured here just because it's really the structure that we're probably all most familiar with. The toy and movable book category encompasses books that are in some way interactive, movable, or toy-like in some fashion. So you have pull tabs, you have lift the flap. On the left there, you can see a tunnel book. I'll be talking more about all of these different structures later. So there's just a very wide variety, some of which we don't even have terms for, but you look at and you say, well, this is, it's a book and it's also a toy, or it's a book and it's also movable in some way. The other thing that people always ask me is, well, what's the oldest book that you're working with, or what's the oldest movable book? And movables actually date back to the Middle Ages with, very often in the medieval books, you would have volvels, which are a paper disc that would be attached to the page at the center so it could rotate. And if you stack a couple of them on top of each other, then you can, progressively smaller, you can then calculate dates for the church calendar, astrological positions of the stars, and sometimes they use them for making codes and cracking codes. So those are really the earliest movable structures, but they are not the earliest movable books for children. So the first book that is a movable for children, and sort of the first toy book, was made in the 1700s. Before 1700, there were almost no books produced specifically for children. Children would have their perennial favorites like Aesop's Fables, but they weren't real. There were very, very few that were produced specifically for children's uses. Then in the early 1700s, you started getting fairy stories. Newbery offered toys with books, which is sort of slowly evolving towards the idea of if you get a toy with the book, maybe the book itself could be a toy. And so Robert Sayer, who was an 18th century bookseller in London, about 1765 began experimenting with different ways to make a movable book. And what he came up with is, now this book is, as you can see, is from 1814, but this is one of the ones we have at the library, and it is the exact same structure as what Robert Sayer originally did, and it also, the content is very similar to what was ultimately produced around within like the first 30 years of these books. And so essentially they're generally called turn-up books, not turnip like the vegetable, but turn up. I've had a couple of people say, what are these, like horticultural books? And I was like, no, they're... And so essentially you have a piece of paper that's folded in at the top and bottom, and then when you open the top flap, so here this is a depiction of Adam, and you fold up the top, and then Adam becomes Eve, and now there's a serpent in the tree, and then you fold down the bottom, and in this one, Eve becomes a mermaid. And of course, the problem with these books is that the content all has to be related, pictorially, and it's sometimes a little weird, like you suddenly get a mermaid, and then the tree's just hanging out over there. So sometimes they were more effective than others. Robert Sayer's original book, he relied on the popularity of the Harlequin pantomime theater, and you'll see a lot of these toy and movable books, generally publishers kind of hedged their bets with, let's go with a content that's already really popular. So, we have a toy structure that's exciting and hopefully content that people are also already interested in. And then also these books were very expensive to produce. So I think another reason that is, not having to generate content would cut down some on the production cost. So sometimes these turnip books are actually called Harlequinades because so many were about the Harlequin pantomime theater. And so with this, so those were the first sort of lift the flap books, which, later evolved into more traditional lift the flap book structures. And also, this book is from much later in, I believe, 1879. G.W. Carlton and Company produced this magical Mother Goose series. And so it's the same sort of idea, but here you have the flap is sort of worked into, it's more of a traditional book structure, but you can see the flap there, and here's little Jack Horner, who's eating his Christmas pie, and then you turn the flap and he discovers a plum and is sort of taken aback. It's very dramatic. But of course, again, you have to relate the first content to the second, which can be difficult and is a little bit limiting in terms of your content production. So after these turn-up books, you get around, just in the early 1800s, the Temple of Fancy with S&J Fuller produced these paper doll books where you see, this is Cinderella, who's, she's not the earliest one. The earliest ones were about 1810. You'll also notice in this, I don't give exact dates because just a lot of these, we really don't have the exact dates for the, we can kind of get like, it might have been in this 5-year period because, it was produced at this place and we know they were in this studio during that period, but so forgive me for the lack of exactness. But these paper doll structures, you would have a head that would then get put into various outfits. So Cinderella was sort of a good one because with any of these, you have to have several outfits in order for them to really work. So we have, Cinderella, dressing up versus being the servant in the household. This one's a little bit more elaborate than, we have a book on display, Little Henry, who's one of the earlier paper doll books. But Cinderella gets a carriage, whereas Little Henry does not. And the other wonderful thing about this is that the Library of Congress copy of this book actually has a second head, which you can see on the right there where she's getting married. And that's not accounted for in other copies, so it's sort of an extra special one of the paper doll books. Of course, like all of these were very expensive to produce. And they were expensive to buy. They were successful. There were certainly many of them around. But sort of the next step in this is that Dean & Son, particularly in terms of being a successful book publisher, in the 1840s, they really devoted themselves to the children's book trade. Dean & Son was founded by Thomas Dean just before 1800, and ultimately in 1847 he partnered with his son George to form Dean & Son. And that was, in the 1840s, that was around the time that they really started getting into the children's book trade. So this is one of sort of their first foray into children's movable books, which is Master Rose. And on display we have Miss Rose, which is very similar. Now, if you're reading very carefully, you'll notice that this was not published by Dean. This book was not published by Dean & Son. In London, it was published in New York by someone else. However, the content is almost exactly the same as the books originally published by Dean. It's probably just, a pirated American copy, but if you look at the pictures of the original books, they're exactly the same. The only difference is, in our copy of Miss Rose, she announces herself to be an American girl rather than an English girl, but and it sort of messes up the rhyme, but it's definitely, again, the content, these were really manufactured to be toys, and the content is sometimes not as exciting as you might want. But this is sort of an evolution in some ways of the paper doll form, where, as you can see, there's a hole on the left there in each of the pages, and the head, just like in the paper doll form, shows through where, in this case, Master Rose is trying on different outfits. Here he's dressed like a Turk, here he's dressed like a Dutchman, and here he is in Spanish dress. And so it's very similar to the paper doll books, but more straightforward in the construction. So The other very interesting thing about Dean and Sons is that they were the first to, they produced what is considered to be the first pop-up book. But before the pop-up book, we have the tunnel book structure. And before I tell you about the tunnel books, I would just like to say we have a wonderful tunnel book on display. It's this book, but we have the most amazing stand for it, and it looks so lovely. And so I encourage everyone to go over and take a peek through the window, and you will get to see the Place Vendôme in Paris. This is a German copy, but essentially this structure, it's probably based on traveling peep shows, which is the same kind of thing. You have the two stiff front cover and back cover. There's a hole in the front where you look through, and then the inside is cut away so that you can see all the way to the back, and it creates sort of an interesting three-dimensional effect. And they have the accordion folds along the side or on the top and bottom. So that's what Dean and Son, essentially, that idea they took and used to make what is considered to be the first pop-up book, which is Little Red Riding Hood here. They called them scenic books, and essentially, there's the full cover. When you open the book, you would be presented with this, which you can tell you can't see the text, and there's sort of this green piece of paper but if you pull the ribbon on the side, as you pull it up, it was attached to 3 layers of illustrations, and those would come up, and there it is, half open, and then you would get this sort of beautiful scenic effect with 3 layers. So very similar to the tunnel book, but it's each individual page has an illustration. So there's Little Red Riding Hood picking flowers. And there is, I believe in this version, it is in fact her father that comes and kills the wolf at the end. And then the other thing that I always have to tell people about with these books is that Dean's has so many advertisements on the inside covers of their books, on the backs of their books, advertising their different books. And, in this one, it says, at the very end of the first paragraph, however, there are less secure imitations of these movable books that, they're pioneering. Be sure that you have those published by Dean and Son. The other thing that Dean and Son did was they were some of the first people to work with pull tab structures. And here we have the movable Mother Hubbard and her little dog. This series may have been the first book series to have figures that were actuated by pull tabs, and Mother Hubbard may have been, in England, and Mother Hubbard may have been the first in the series, which is a little difficult to say. So this may be the first figure to be actuated by a pull tab in England. But essentially, the pull tab structure is basically what, we know today is you pull the tab, and in this case, Mother Hubbard curtsies and her dog and is bowing to her. It's, a little less dramatic than some of the structures we're used to, but it's still, at the time, I think it must have been very exciting. And then further with the pull tab structure is the dissolving pictures, which were introduced in England by Dean in the 1860s. This book is from 1862. So dissolving pictures, again, you have a pull tab, which is not pictured here, but essentially it's a sort of window blind structure where as you pull the tab, the slats come over the first picture and create a second picture. So here you have war and then peace, and it's sort of a book of opposites. So Dean also did did a very wide variety of toy and movable books, which may have been why they wound up being so successful. At one point, they had a virtual monopoly on movable books in England. This book, which we also have on display, is Dean's new book of magic illuminations, where if you hold the page to the light, pieces of it seem to glow, where they would, so there are 2 pages. The back page is translucent, and the front page, I always get confused about the front page and the back page, but essentially you would paint part of it, you'd have the front page cut away, the back page would be painted, so that when you hold it up to the light, certain places shined through. So the river wouldn't shine, but the bridge and the moon would shine. And here the lanterns and the rockets, appear to glow. And again, we have all these advertisements for, all these books that they published. And in some ways, it's a little bit almost sad because, you see these advertisements for these books, and, most of these books were owned and used frequently by children. So it's very hard to get our hands on them all the time. And so sometimes you'll be reading the histories, and they'll say, heard of this book, I think this is what it's like, but I've never actually been able to see it. But Dean's was certainly very prolific. So Dean was, one of the first dissolving pictures. One of the things about Dean is that they sort of introduced a lot of new structures, and then others would take these structures and really perfect them. So Ernest Nister did amazing dissolving pictures, and this is from the cover of Our Darling Surprise Pictures. The other thing that I always get confused on is that most of these books, there is another book where the title is almost the exact same as the original book. So this is Our Darling Surprise Pictures. That's one of the more unusual ones. But he also has Here and There, Come and Go, Seesaw Pictures, and they're all a book of changing scenes, so it gets a little confusing. And then the other thing, too, is Nister used to reuse his illustrations periodically, so sometimes you're like, is this in Come and Go or Here and There? And here's the cover page, and you can see at the bottom, Ernest Nister, it's very small, but it says printed in Bavaria. He printed in Germany, but he had offices in London and actually partnered with E.P. Dutton and Company in New York. Unlike some of the more early books where, there were just lots of pirated copies on both sides of the Atlantic. This was actually sort of, this was planned and produced accordingly. But so here you have the initial illustration with the watchman, who appears to be a rooster. Get up at once, the watchman cried, I believe you'll sleep till noon. The magpie's broken in your house and stolen your silver spoon. And so here, as you pull the tab, the illustration begins to change, and ultimately it gets changed into the magpie with the silver spoon. This is from Come and Go, a book of changing pictures. And this one, we actually know the verses were by F.E. Weatherly. Oftentimes, you can kind of assume they were by F.E. Weatherly, but often people were rarely credited specifically for their work. In these illustrations, like Nister may have done a lot of them himself, but maybe not, because the illustrator's signature would get cropped off, and he also was signing as a lithographer, so it's hard to say. But so Weatherly wrote these verses for the modern milkman, and they're very similar to sort of the nursery rhymes that we know. But this one is about a little cat and dog that are selling milk and smoking cigars. And the illustration says, the times have altered truly, 'tis no joke, when cats sell milk and puppies try to smoke. Yes, you see the cat there, trying to sell milk, and as you dissolve the picture, slowly you begin to see the puppy, and there he is sort of giving an odd look to the cigar on the table, like he's not quite sure about the whole situation. So essentially that ends most of these books. The Nister, Dean and Son, and Megendorfer, who I did not talk about, but we have several of his books on display, and he really did these amazing pull tab structures. That was sort of the first golden age of pop-up books. Right now, we're considered to be in the second golden age of pop-up books, which is, I think, evident by just the number of toy and movable books that you see when you go to the bookstore. It's so many of the children's books, are Lift the Flap or Pop-Up, and it's widely available. But after roughly around the time of the First World War, the trade between Germany and Britain was severed, and the pop-up book production sort of, it didn't stop, but it went downhill. It was slower. However, in the 1930s, I have to mention this because it is a pop-up lecture. This was between the first and second golden age. We have C. Carey Cloud and Harold Lintz, who worked for Blue Ribbon Books, and they produced the first pop-up books, which now you're saying, but Little Red Riding Hood was the first pop-up book. But the reason I can get away with saying this is that the term pop-up was not being used to describe books at that time. Blue Ribbon Books copyrighted it in the 30s and then proceeded to put that term on every single book they published with a pop-up picture in it and put it in quotation marks. So you can just barely see the quotation marks under the pop-up Cinderella. And the other thing, there's a lovely Peter Rabbit over on the table of pop-ups there, and you can't see the cover, but in terms of truth in advertising, they are very truthful. They say, the tale of Peter Rabbit with pop-up picture, because there's only one picture in the book. And I have looked that up on the catalog so many times, and it says, we can't find it. And then I say, oh, I said pop-up pictures, and there's only one. You have. But this is Cinderella and Other Tales. The cover suggests other tales. As soon as you get on the inside, it says 3 other tales, only 3. But again, you can see the quotation marks around pop-up. And this is when we really get the pop-up illustrations that we think of today. And this is Cinderella's carriage. And then this is, sort of a view from the front. And one of the things I love about some of these pop-ups is the detail where you can see here, fortunately the light's not great, but the coachman further back, there's no face on the back of the head because that's the back of his head, but it's on the front. So they're very, very careful about these things. This is another pop-up from the same book. This is Goldilocks and the Three Bears, with Goldilocks running away from the house. And it's a little hard to see here, but there's actually a cellophane window pane in the window, and you can kind of see it's shrunk over time, whereas the paper hasn't, and the paper's a little bit wobbly. But just some of these illustrations are just really, really wonderful. And so, just to kind of wrap up the last few remarks is Dean and Son, who, like I said, they really had, for a while, the monopoly on pop-up books in England. And for a while, they were the oldest firm continuously engaged in producing toy and movable, or toy books. They did a lot of different structures, flexible face storybooks, which, if you have children, you've probably seen the books where there's kind of a puppet in the center of the book that you can put your finger in and move around a little bit. That's what this was, just a very early version of it. Cloth books, they printed on untearable linen. Tunnel books, they'd have these applique structures to create kind of a three-dimensional perspective. It wasn't super successful, but they really did just about every form of toy and movable book imaginable. In the 1980s, they were bought by Paul Hamlin Group, although they're still used as an imprint. And so, essentially, Dean's, did not take these structures really to the furthest extent they could take them, but they introduced a lot of new structures and sort of paved the way for this second golden age of toy and movable books that we're in now. So, and that is my talk.
Thank you, sir. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
So when did we start using the term paper engineering?
Paper engineering. You know, that is a good question that I don't know. Certainly, all the research I've done refers to specific people as doing the paper engineering, but you know, most of these books are from the last 50 years. So I actually don't know the answer to that. I would love to be able to find out.
Have you found any non-Western examples of pop-up books or other toy books like this?
That was not the main focus of my research. A lot of the books we have are, you know, at the Library of Congress are from the U.S. and Europe. And so because those are the books that are available to study, that's mostly what I did.
In this collection, the
Yeah.
Asian materials and materials that would have come from other cultures are likely in the Asian division and African Middle Eastern division, both of which have movable pieces, but they wouldn't have been available for our project.
But they do exist. And,
I know that there are Asian books that unfold in ways that construct shelters and then go back in.
Awesome.
You said that these books were pretty expensive. How expensive were they compared to like a regular novel?
It varied depending on the structure. They were definitely, some of them, the paper doll books were really quite expensive for the time, which even though there were probably a good 10 or 15 ones produced, they really, you don't see them continuing that much. And Dean's in the 1870s, you know, as probably everyone was at the time, switched to colored printing rather than hand colored to try to cut down on the cost of production. So, and then you also get examples of people who probably did not charge enough to really make a profit off of their books. Grimaldi, who I did not mention in this talk, did, you know, a very nice book called A Suit of Armor for Youth, which is really very well made, but just wasn't particularly successful. And, you know, he likely just couldn't get, you know, the cost of production versus what people were willing to pay for a book to work out very well.
Do you have any idea about what type of volume they were produced in? You know?
Some of them were in runs of about 200. Again, it's very difficult to find good hard numbers on a lot of these books. You know, Muir actually suggests that the Dean series of dissolving pictures was not particularly successful, even though, again, they did have several runs of them. But it's hard to say. There's not a lot of, you know, good factual information, or not fact, but specific information on them. But
what was your favorite thing you stumbled upon, and why would that have been different than the others?
well, I told Jackie I know someone's going to ask me what my favorite one is, and I really don't have a favorite. You know.
Top three.
What I finally was thinking is that for each book, I have a favorite thing about that book. I will, as much as I really love every single book I looked at, and particularly all the ones that are on display, the illustration that consistently puts a smile on my face is actually there's a book right by Mark there that's Buck Rogers' 25th Century. And you can see the character, well, if you come up and look, the characters there are being attacked by a giant reptile, and that is what the caption read: attacked by the giant reptile. So it's I am fond of that illustration.
Sarah, thanks for the talk. That was really, really great. A couple related questions about periodical press. One, I know that your talk is on books, and so you might not have come across it. but were there ever pop-up or movable toy elements in a periodical, you know, like a supplement or something like that? And the second question is, was there a cultural discourse about the incursion of toy books? Did certain educators think, this isn't so good, they should be reading Latin instead of Latin?
The short answer to the second question is yes, there was definitely a lot of, particularly in the late 19th century of, you know, what are these books teaching our children? And, you know, should these stories have a moral? And again, sometimes with the content, you'll see people kind of trying to shoehorn a moral in, and it just doesn't quite work. In terms of periodicals, I really did not come across anything referring to that. And again, that may be one of those things that just, it was so ephemeral that there's no way to really know. It's the children's book publishing was not, you know, it was very iffy at that time. So if you'll forgive the term, there were firms popping up and kind of going out of business. I can't imagine someone didn't try it, I would imagine, but I did not come across anything.
There are paper dolls in Germany where chromolithography is a little more popular than the kind of color printing that we're seeing here. There are paper dolls that tear out, and then you build a wardrobe over time, but nothing.
And there were some in some advertisements, like Pear's soap, there'd be little things that would pop off the page, and little props and things like that.
There were indeed some periodicals that did have quite elaborate structures. For example, one that was originally published in Japan and then came to the United States after World War II. So there are some examples, but not really a mainstream American 19th century journal.
Yeah, I seem to remember an issue of either New York Magazine or New Yorker that had a pop-up cover. And in the past 10 years, maybe, I might even have it in a box somewhere. I thought it was pretty unusual. I think it was a skyscraper.
That sounds very exciting. I missed that issue.
That wouldn't be children's.
So I think what we'll do, there are a lot of books out here, and I'd like you to ask, that you indulge me for a moment, if we can, as you've noticed, these are very fragile for many reasons. They're produced in the unfortunate period of time in which acidic paper is popular. They were owned and handled by children. And they have attachments that are tenuous at best. So one of the things that we work with in this division, and it's an expensive proposition, is to try and slowly restore these to workable condition. Should there be a moment in which you feel compelled to want to adopt a book, we can always talk. But given that, at the moment they are fragile. So if we could have the students that are sitting at the picnic table slowly move away and give them a chance to get away from the table before you all go rushing towards these pop-ups, it might be a little safer. And also along here, if you can give us just a second or two to clear the chairs away, it'll give you a better chance to see the books without without making me worry about it. And as we've said at every one of these sessions, there are a lot of people here who will be happy to show you whatever you would like to see. And please don't handle the books, especially in this case. You do not want to be the person that breaks a Megan Dorfer book. You really don't want to be that person. But before we do that, can we congratulate Sarah?
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.